is Keys to the Shop, episode 349, discussing 21st century coffee with Kenneth Davids. Well, hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFirio. I'm your host for the show. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in today. Please do subscribe to Keys to the Shop. It's a great way to support the show and also to support yourself because you get to be updated with new content as it comes out. And we often have a lot of content coming out through the shift break episodes, the main episodes on Tuesdays, Founder Fridays at the end of the month, and so much more. Rate of Rise, roasting focused episodes on the top of the month usually. There's so much to participate in, and I would hate for you to miss any of it. So go ahead and get subscribed now, and also share these episodes with a friend. That really helps the growth of Keys to the Shop like nothing else. Thank you everybody for doing that. Now, if you want to build foundations for success, you want clarity in your coffee shop business, you want to find solutions for problems that you might be experiencing now, you just want to have a thriving cafe, Keys to the Shop Consulting can work directly with you to help you achieve all those things and more through remote consultation, coaching, and on-site training and assessments of your coffee shop. Whether you're just starting out in the coffee business or you're already an operator, Keys to the Shop Consulting focuses on your operations, quality, and people to help you build an amazing coffee retail business. If that sounds interesting to you and you want to learn more, just go ahead and email me. Chris@keystotheshop.com is the email to use to set up a free discovery call. We'll talk all about what's going on and how Keys to the Shop Consulting can help. Now, one of the things that I really love seeing is when we take coffee and are able to really bring about its full potential in the cup. And I know you love that too. And that's exactly why I love the Ground Control Cyclops brewer from Voga Coffee. This is a revolutionary brewer that absolutely achieves exactly what I just said. You're able to extract an unprecedented range of flavors from your coffee with the SCA award-winning technology in the Ground Control. It gives you ultimate control over the extraction process. And this is not only creating next-level batch brew coffee, but it also makes tea, batch diced lattes, and batch cold brew. So it helps in the efficiency and productivity of your bar, all while giving you that quality level up. I definitely recommend checking them out over at groundcontrol.coffee to learn more about this wonderful brewer. If you really want to show your coffee off in the best possible way to your customers, all while increasing the productivity and efficiency of your bar, the Ground Control Cyclops brewer is definitely something you should look into getting. Again, check them out over at groundcontrol.coffee. Today's episode is also brought to you by the Pacific Barista Series. The Barista Series is the line of plant-based performance beverages that are created for baristas and approved by professional baristas all over the world. And when I say approved by, I mean they're actually tested by world-class baristas before they're even released to the public. So this extensive lineup of plant-based offerings that the Barista Series has, it actually performs on bar by standing up to the heat from steaming, producing amazing texture for latte art, and also the balance of the beverage is focused on the coffee. And this is all done to further the cause of specialty coffee and give people options and not just, have to settle for something that's not really created with flavor in mind. It's created with flavor and performance in mind, and it really shows. So go check them out over at pacificfoodservice.com. Get samples in your store and try it for yourself. I really do think you're going to love it. And if you're looking for the best options for your plant-based coffee customers, then I highly recommend you use the Barista Series from Pacific. All right, everybody. Well, today I am really kind of awestruck by our guest. We have a living legend in coffee, honestly, Kenneth Davids, who is the editor, chief writer, and co-founder of Coffee Review, and so much more. And even just that is in and of itself an amazing thing. But he has been involved in coffee since the early 1970s and has published 3 books on coffee, including the really influential Home Roasting, Romance and Revival book, the book Coffee, A Guide to Buying, Brewing and Enjoying, which I'm actually holding in my hand right now as I'm recording. It's one of the original releases of this book back in the early 70s, which is awesome, which, by the way, has sold nearly 250,000 copies in 5 different editions. Ken's workshops and seminars on coffee sourcing and evaluation and communication have been featured at professional coffee meetings on 6 different continents, and he is a professor emeritus of critical studies at the California College of Arts in San Francisco. And in 1996, he was awarded a Special Achievement Award for outstanding contributions to coffee literature by the Specialty Coffee Association of America. And now his books, of course, if you've been in coffee for a while, you've probably read some of Kenneth's books. His book on roasting and the book Coffee, A Guide to Buying, Brewing and Enjoying, they are quintessential for people just getting started in coffee. And so many of us start in the industry as enthusiasts who are introduced to that world through people like Kenneth in his work, which was what he always set out to do. And he has written a new book called 21st Century Coffee, A Guide, and it is an unprecedentedly thorough survey of specialty coffee in all of its aspects as it exists today. So much has changed since the early 1970s in terms of, how we enjoy and understand specialty coffee. And in this conversation with Kenneth, we're going to be covering his goals for writing this book, and comparing and contrasting the two, his original book in the beginning in the early 70s to this one today, and trying to cover as much as we can between those two bookends of an industry that is so complex and has evolved so much. So we're talking not only about the professional world of coffee development, but also how consumers have evolved as a result of how a specialty coffee has grown up all these decades later. Kenneth is one of our industry's most influential people, and his work has shaped multiple generations of coffee enthusiasts and professionals. And in this sense, I guess an hour of conversation is pretty woefully insufficient to give you an idea the breadth of Kenneth's journey and work, but here we are. So I can honestly say it was a true honor to speak with Kenneth and to feature his wisdom and perspectives on this show. And I'm thrilled to be able to present this to you all, and that he has written this new book, and you definitely should go out there and purchase this book as soon as you can. So without anything else from me, let's get right to it. I am absolutely honored and thrilled to present to you a conversation with Kenneth Davids. Well, Kenneth, it is an incredible honor to welcome you to Keys to the Shop. How are you doing today?
I'm doing terrific, Chris. Thank you.
I have a lot to ask you about. We have a lot to talk about because you've done a lot in coffee. You've seen so much. And as we were chatting before recording here, we were talking about your start in coffee was back in 1972, where you started a coffee shop. You started a cafe, which technically makes this your 50-year anniversary for being in the coffee industry, quote unquote. So happy anniversary.
Thank you.
So spending half century in coffee is no small feat. And I have on my shelf, it's the second edition, but it's from 1976 version of your book on coffee called Coffee, the Guide to Brewing, Roasting, Enjoying. I might have got those 3 mixed up. But you've got this new book out now, 21st Century Coffee. Essentially, it is, for all intents and purposes, the same goal, I think, as your first book, that is such a ubiquitous a resource in the coffee industry for so many of us, except this book is a lot bigger because coffee is bigger. Talk to us a little bit about your goals for your first book compared to this one.
I think the goal is the same. I don't know if I usually say this exactly the same way, but it's to elevate coffee as a genuine specialty beverage worthy of the same level of connoisseurship and attention and cultural prestige as beverages like wine. So that's continued for all these, I won't say 50, these many years. That's always been the goal of everything I've done, in a sense. And so that was the goal with the first book. And it's still the goal. It's just that the context has changed, the audience has changed, the business has changed. I've changed, I suppose.
Let me ask you about the changes in the industry by kind of zeroing in on the idea that there's this goal of elevating coffee that in the initial book was, I think, a bit more of an ask, I think, for the fact that the industry was so young, and for many places just non-existent in terms of platforms where it could be elevated. Today, we have lots of different platforms and resources and communities. And with this goal being the same, has it become easier to achieve those goals? And how have they contextualized over the years? Seeing as how they're the same today, how are they easier or are they easier? And how have they been contextualized based on how the industry has changed?
Well, from a writer's point of view, it's more challenging, of course, because the knowledge base is enormously increased on coffee and my own knowledge, and it's simply the industry has grown, and in its complexity and its ambitions, and so in that sense, I think it's more challenging to write now, but and it's also hard, perhaps, to identify the exact point to enter the dialogue to further that goal. Nevertheless, I followed my instincts, which is a certain kind of person that I'm addressing that I know from the internet and of coffee enthusiasts, and I'm talking to them and trying to provide a kind of a depth and honesty of information and authority of information that they may not be getting in scripts and scraps and internet communications.
That's a really good point, because there is, with all the proliferation of information, there's a lot of good information, sure, but there's also a lot of bad information out there, maybe just as much as back in the day when it was really, the ball was getting rolling, and maybe at that time it was more based on, pure like large scale company marketing. And now it feels like it's distributed to a lot of smaller players saying a lot of different things to try to get their marketing jabs in about coffee and about what you should believe about brewing and tasting and things like that. And it makes me just kind of curious about your entry into writing about coffee itself, from owning a cafe. How did you decide that you were going to transition into that particular vein of the industry versus just sticking with the coffee shop and building a coffee company?
Well, I think I'd like to go back to one interesting point you made, Chris, that regarding the proliferation of information from different sources, and especially coffee. I have just enormous, and this is totally honest, enormous respect for that matrix of voices. And in the book, I'm trying to promote and elevate it. And I just think that I'm a lover of books. I'm a writer. I'm a lover of books. And I wanted to make a book that had simultaneously was engaging and easy to read, and but authoritative, and knew when to leave some details out and when to get into them, when to cite sources and when not to, and present that in a way in which there are photos, there are rich captions to the photos, there are tables, there's the voice, my voice, pulsing through, and then there are little text boxes on kinds of questions people have. So I wanted to the difference between this book and the last one was that the last one just had my voice moving through it, and that was adequate at the time to cover what was known about coffee and what I could say about coffee. But now it requires a more complex act of communication. And that's what I tried to do in this book.
When you mentioned earlier the depth of information and honesty of information, it kind of made me think as compared to what are the pitfalls of somebody who wants to learn about coffee today. Going through the book here, it is absolutely as you describe it. It's a tapestry of various texts and captions and pictures and the graphs, and all the information works together to sort of boost the information that it's meant to convey, so that there's understanding and not just communication of information. To me, that seems like the understanding versus communication only is kind of what you might mean by the depth of information. So I wonder if you could lean into that a little bit. And for you, what's the difference between writing something that's factual and then writing something that has honesty and depth?
I think partly it's testing everything against my own experience and my own nervous system, making sure that the studies, for example, that I cited in the book, that I had, in a sense, confirmed them myself. Sounds rather egotistical. I mean, not the studies of environment and issues like that, but things having to do with sensory. So I just tried to come from a actual experiential base while not ignoring the wealth of information that's available, separating some of the hype, because people are selling things and they have good knowledge and good products, but they want to sell them. So I have to stick with the knowledge and the products and ignore the selling part.
So this pursuit of having this honest dialogue about coffee, you removed yourself from the commercial aspect of it in a way by not continuing on with owning a coffee shop. But in continuing to sort of be the spokesperson for coffee and to serve the coffee industry in that way. And as you did that, I imagine it opened up a lot of opportunities for you to experience coffee to a greater variety of coffee, if you will. How did your tastes and your own knowledge of coffee change over time as you started to become a professional writer for the coffee industry?
Before I had opened the coffee shop, I was a typical kind of young guy who vagabonded in Europe and discovered espresso and cafes. And that was the romance that got me into it. But then I discovered specialty coffee, in other words, medium roasted coffees from various origins, and the sources and the origins and the richness of the socioeconomic context and historical context. That just totally drew me in. And as the industry grew and there were more opportunities for learning, I was able to plunge into them. And you're probably right. If you're selling something, you certainly your vision increases and your experience increases. But I had a kind of a freedom to hop around. And, I've been hired as consultant, and I've avoided jobs always that would put me in competition with the coffees that I am reviewing on Coffee Review. But I was able to find traveling consulting in particular opportunities. So that was a tremendous enriching part of it. Now, whether I would have done that had I started my own coffee company, I don't know. I'm a little nostalgic sometimes, because sometimes I would like to create coffee, but I'm creating knowledge about coffee and information about coffee, and that's also a commercial thing, of course.
Sure.
So
not much is not a commercial thing. From the point where you started expanding that view and that deepening of your own knowledge was happening, I imagine that was tracking parallel to the attitudes of the people you were writing to, also coffee enthusiasts and maybe future coffee enthusiasts that were not quite there. They weren't buying all of the gear, and they weren't seeking out the beans the way that yourself and others were, but they were kind of on the fence. And so the community was expanding, but people's attitudes towards coffee was changing. And so I'm curious if you could sort of talk about how people perceived coffee in the time where you were writing your original book in the versions to follow, and how maybe your own progress in coffee tracked along with the progress of sort of the national or even international enthusiast community?
I mean, obviously, when I started, it was just tiny little pockets of what we would call specialty coffee, and everybody else drank regular or decaf. So as the opportunities arose to learn about coffee, about the various styles of coffee, about the nuances of processing. As processing experiments have proliferated, I've learned along with them. I'd like to learn them even better than I do, but I've tracked them every step of the way, every year that they change. And so I guess my sense of the possibility of coffee has expanded. I think one thing that bothers me, and I don't know this is relevant to your question, but there seems to be increasingly in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly a kind of a gulf between the availability of a really solid, dependable, nuanced, but cup at a decent price, and the energy that the industry is putting into producing more and more extraordinary coffees that will achieve publicity and attention for them. I'm all for that experience and that pushing forward, but I'm a little concerned, at least in my role at Coffee Review, that we're not paying enough attention to affordable, accessible coffees at the same time.
That's interesting. Yeah, that is a conversation that I know myself and a lot of others have ongoing, and the accessibility idea versus, pushing things forward. It seems the question could be, what is forward? Forward to what is the question? Unto what? What are we pushing forward to? Yeah, I don't know if this is a fair comparison. And I would ask you, would it be similar to how people in the days that the first book that you wrote came out were thinking about specialty coffee? Is the community of coffee looking at anaerobic fermentation and geisha varieties and coffees that seem relatively inaccessible because of their price point and preciousness in the industry? Are those similar to just when people started talking about pea berries back in the 70s and started talking about specialty coffee? Is it the same thing over again, or is it unique to this time?
That's an interesting question. If just that the understanding is different, then the understanding then was based on a kind of in a sense, a simple wine analogy where you had roast levels and then you had origins. And the origins were the supply chain cultivated all of the kinds of decisions along the way that would maintain a certain consistency from origins. And as we know, that's completely broken down now. And that's one of the issues I'm trying to deal with in the book, to sort that out. The difference between ordinary or decent, good specialty coffee, excellent Kenya, for example, and a super refined coffee, that particular space had not opened up at that point. So you would pay more for a really fine Kenya, but there obviously wasn't that a gap of many, many dollars between the really fine but conventional coffee and the really exceptional refined small lot coffee. And so I think at the time, I would say that specialty coffees were rather accessible in terms of pricing for people. I mean, that would be an interesting piece of research, but not one I think I'm going to do. But yeah, I think if there was not the enormous gulf in price. Now, I don't think that's necessarily bad. I mean, I think that if, again, with the comparison with the wine industry, you have bottles of wine bought at auctions for tens of thousands of dollars or more, single bottles, and then you have $2 chuck, all kinds of levels in between. So I think that it's fine if we move towards that. It's fine with me. I think at Coffee Review, we have to honor what we taste. And I take home some of the coffees we taste, and they're just so phenomenal. I mean, they're just light up the day. And so I'm just a little sad that exceptional character isn't a little more available, that we're losing the middle a little, and we have to pay attention to it. That's how I feel, and how exactly to articulate that in terms of our reviewing even and our sourcing is very difficult. I'm off my book now and more in Coffee Review, but at any rate.
Well, in so much of what you put in this book is based on the evolution of your own understanding of coffee through these years. And so I view everything that you've done up until this point to be very relevant to this book. And that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, as you made your way in throughout the industry writing about coffee, you founded Coffee Review. And I think that was 97, correct? 1997?
Yes.
What precipitated that? Why start Coffee Review? And what did you want to accomplish in it? What was in there that was similar to the goals that you had in your writing?
Well, there was no arena for judgment of exceptional character in coffee, really. I would say that especially the industry at the time made its judgments on the basis of refined commercial expectations, which was cleanliness and consistency. For me, that is just writing coffee way short in terms of its potential. So I wanted to introduce a place where people who did exceptional coffees could be recognized and rewarded. I'm very ambivalent and always have been about the numerical system. I mean, I hope you realize that we started it at Coffee Review.
Yeah.
SCA did not. They came in about a year later, but I'm glad they did. But at any rate, and you may notice in my book, I don't get into numbers and ratings. I just try to cultivate in the reader an understanding of how to taste coffees and how to recognize pleasure, find that pleasure, find that, and have the willingness to reward the producers for that pleasure.
In the formation of Coffee Review, in introducing a numerical system, in introducing what is still today used as a framework for understanding the idea of what a coffee could offer. So you see a number and you associate that with what it may or may not have in the cup. And for better, for worse, it's there, and it is. I think, either it can be used like any other tool in a helpful way or in an unhelpful way. I'm more curious about the kind of coffees that you saw in 97 versus even 10 to 20 years after that, where it may have been just the reflection of how the industry was coming to understand coffee. I'm guessing that the types of coffees that you were reviewing in the beginning are markedly different than the ones that you ended up reviewing even today, and what you believe the cause is for some of those major changes in profiles and goals that roasters have with how they approach certain origins that were different than the way people used to pursue or portray origins.
Well, we probably don't need to thrash through the whole history of dark roasting and then the pulling back from it. But if we leave that out, I think at the beginning, when in 97, the dark roasting hadn't taken over temporarily the specialty coffee world. And I think the coffees that that I had then were from very exceptional importers, from Erna Knudsen and from Union Coffee, and a lot of new, experienced, but exceptional pioneering importers. So they were very good coffees, but they followed the idea of origin. So I would always look for a Kenya, because Kenyas were the most dependably exceptional and distinctive coffees. And then there was the Ethiopia Yirgacheffe was just being established then, which was another kind of dependable, interesting coffee. And then beyond that, you really needed to find a good roaster and importer who knew what they were doing to get the really top Guatemala, as opposed to a kind of ordinary Guatemala. So that, of course, has changed now. We have this very rich kind of matrix of relationships between producers and importers, where the importers are co-creating the coffee almost between the roaster and the producer. That very richness produces a much larger array of possibilities than in 1997.
There's a lot more for customers to choose from.
Yeah. And I think that there was a time, I think, in the middle there when there was a lot of false specialty, that less and less of that now, where people would take a very ordinary Colombia and talk about Huila and I don't know, a lot of other stuff that probably had no relevance really, and sell it as a specialty. And you might get a very drab coffee, a very lazy cup. I'm not picking on Colombia at all, but that was just one of the favorites at the time.
Well, it reminds me of greenwashing, the way we talk about greenwashing today in sustainability circles, where you can pass off something that's quite average as being progressive in its nature by using the words and dressing it up in the marketing speak. Sounds pretty similar.
Right. In terms of coffee quality, in our experience at Coffee Review, that particular abuse has lessened.
I mean, the commercialization aspect of coffee has always been a influential part of why people purchase things. There's a combination of, we tell them what to look for in coffee because, a consumer may or may not invent for themselves a new category of coffee unless we come around and say, hey, did you know there's better coffee? And then they're going to listen. So we
Right.
kind of create the demand and then also respond to the demand.
Right.
So I'm curious about how, that has evolved, in that hopefully we've been doing an all right enough job that the average consumer today is, I think, better educated about what to look for in coffee, although they have to sift through a sea of terminology and packaging and claims and things like that. What role does marketing play in creating the customer's expectations of what specialty coffee is and should be? As you talked about, having the importer sort of co-create with farmers in a lot of ways, that equation doesn't include the consumer. I'm wondering, how does the consumer play into this? Is there a lot of inbuilt or native desire in the consumer that we're listening to, or are we just kind of doing our own thing and then always just informing the customer, this is what you should be looking for in coffee?
I'm afraid it's the latter, mostly. I mean, the roasters really drive the industry, I think, the communication between the roaster and the advanced consumer. And so, yes, they try to surprise the consumer with something new, and product differentiation, of course, is always important, as well as a dependable product. On the other hand, so I think, I think the roasters do it, and I think we're at Coffee Review, we try to call the roasters out a little bit, and in a sense, and not directly but indirectly, saying, put your coffee where your publicist's mouth is. And,
Well, you're getting all of these top tier coffees, and a lot of people are they use their coffee review score as a way of marketing their roastery because they have a 90 plus, et cetera, coffee as reviewed by Coffee Review. And so it produces, it's an interesting balance to say there's a gap, and at the same time, calling people to say, look, you need to, like you said, roast coffees that back up what you're talking about, but then they're only sending you their best of the best of the best, and the motivations that they have may be to just win that thing, but not necessarily to roast to fill that gap. So,
yeah.
I guess the question is like, how do we take the next step as an industry to say we've come so far? How do we not leave people behind?
Well, that's what we're wrestling with at Coffee Review. How can we encourage and review and reward coffees that are produced on a larger scale at an affordable price, while still rewarding exceptional creative efforts? I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a real issue, not just for Coffee Review, but for the industry as a whole. In my book, I'm avoiding these extremes. I'm trying to create knowledge, but knowledge, that's difficult. You can't expect a consumer to sit down and read a lengthy book and absorb all of it and then go out and practice cupping until they know what they like in coffee.
Well, here's a interesting. I hope you take this as a compliment on your book. That there is a very helpful frustration that a consumer looking for a quick answer to a question, "What's the best coffee?" I just want to roast or I want to drink the best coffee. It wouldn't necessarily be a satisfying read in that sense, because the lack of making definitive or extreme statements in the book by saying these are the only things you should drink allows people to sort of intuit that maybe there's more than what they're trying to accomplish. Now, there's more than just trying to find the best. There could be lots of bests, and this book obviously goes into great detail about all the possibilities that coffee offers beyond it seems like the narrowing of the scope in terms of top 1% of coffees that are out there. So I think that's really a great part of this book, is that it does provide that depth and the breadth of the industry that would say, hey, well, maybe I've been thinking a little bit too closed-mindedly about specialty coffee this whole time.
I think the idea of providing consumers a quick set of knowledge, that's a concern of mine. But so you're right. I mean, that's something I think my book gives inspiration and excitement and resonance, but doesn't really help people who are in a hurry and just want to make good decisions and taste good coffees and spend 10 minutes reading about it. It doesn't help them that much. Perhaps I can help in a future book or future publication.
When I first got into coffee, I had a book written by, it was somebody named Robert Thorne. I'm pretty sure it was a small hardcover book, and it was just an encyclopedia of different coffee origins, facts about the country. And in my infancy in coffee, it was like I was on a plane traveling to these places, and it created this depth that allowed me to build a solid career in coffee, but just a love for what was possible that I could never fulfill. And I think that's important, that people are just wowed and given a sense of majesty around coffee, because then you're always going to be pursuing it. And it wouldn't really be any fun if it was really just, a one-for-one exchange of, now I've reached everything. So let me ask about this book specifically, how you decided the relevant information to put into it, because I bet it could have been twice as thick. And it's a big book and it's well done. Although there's probably a lot more information out there that could go into a book like this. So you have to curate this stuff and make sure that you're communicating what is the most relevant and essential in your opinion. How did you go about sorting through what to include?
Well, I don't think I had a system, Chris. Again, I thought about my this sort of amorphous but very clear kind of ideal or potential reader. And I tried to edit so that I wasn't showing off any knowledge or over explaining. But at the same time, I tried to make the text complete, so you didn't have to bring a lot of knowledge to it. In other words, the opposite of scholarly writing in one hand, but on the other hand, it's like scholarly writing in terms of that I really tried to vet carefully everything that I put in it.
So as this funnels all that information into a book, there is this overload of information that we can give to consumers. Sometimes it's we talk about this with coffee bags, for instance. The labels will give all sorts of information. And some of us are really concerned about giving too much information because customers are just going to glaze over and they don't want to read all of that. I think a book is slightly different because you're not standing in line at a coffee shop. Presumably you're sitting in a comfortable chair reading a book, so you might have time. But how do we avoid information overload and give people information that will enamor them with coffee, which is your goal here, instead of having it just create enmity between them and coffee?
I'm not sure. That's a difficult question, Chris. And Coffee Review, we try to provide a succinct review that people can just pop right into and then pop out of. As far as the coffee writing on websites, which has replaced bags really as the main conveyor of this kind of information, I confess that I enjoy reading the extra stuff that about the farm. I mean, so long as it's not banal and repetitive, and vague. Oh, make sure that the wildlife is well cared for on their farm. Well, that's good, but what does that mean? Writing seems to be better and more thorough and more complete. And so for me, I mean, reading, say, 4 paragraphs about a farm and a coffee is not maybe it's because I'm a coffee freak and it's not a waste of time, but it seems to me that somebody who's mildly interested, that 4 paragraphs is not much to read. Another issue, of course, is the sensory. Can I lead with one of your questions that?
Oh, please do.
Yeah, which is the question of communicating sensory. Well, this is what I took from your question: communicating sensory character in language, which of course is very challenging and difficult. And the common solution in the industry is to use the 3 adjective description. So you pick 3 prominent, that you and your cuppers have found 3 prominent notes. Usually, I would imagine, reading through behind them or reading into them, that you try to make one of the notes surprising, like pink bubble gum or jackfruit or something, and the other 2 more common, chocolate or something, and you try to make them real so that they're actually there. The consumer can find them. And I think that's a good approach, because the consumer finds one of them and says, hey, I found something, this is good, this is new, my world has expanded. But I think there's a drawback to doing that too, because I think those 3 adjectives don't give a very complete, nuanced sense of the completeness of the coffee, of the structure of the coffee, and doesn't place it in a social context. And so we try to do a little more at Coffee Review than those 3 words. Now, where the golden place between those 2 extremes is, I'm not sure.
I suppose you would have to know your audience and know your customer base to understand what they can handle, which is,
Yeah,
a interesting thing to
right.
think about because, for instance, some of these chapters on processing and things that you go into great detail in this book are absent from your first book. And I'm curious, I imagine the consumer or the person, even in the enthusiast reading the book in that era, may have been overwhelmed by that. But I take it that the average consumer today, an enthusiast, is much more steeped in knowledge and hardy in a sense. They can handle a lot more information and maybe even come with a lot more information already formed. So these chapters are longer than they used to be. Or is that mainly because the evolution of what customers already understand about coffee?
They do understand more, that definitely. But I think that, again, as you pointed out earlier, a lot of this taste making comes through the roaster and the producer now as well. And so I think, for instance, naturals, the popularity of natural processed coffees. Now, this has been very interesting to me because for years when I did consumer tasting, I would get a substantial number. I liked Yemen's because I worked there for a while, and I'd bring in a Yemen, a kind of a little bit of fermenty but sweet Yemen, and I'd bring in a couple really nice washed coffees, which were the norm then at the time. And about half the people, at least, would always prefer the natural. But the industry at the time just put them down relentlessly as crap. And I think that the move towards naturals was in part driven by the consumers. I think that's one change that I feel the consumers led on, or at least collaborated powerfully on. So when roasters started to offer natural Ethiopias, I think the consumers fed back powerfully in favor of those coffees. That's my impression.
Hmm.
So in that sense, in these very broad changes, and of course the taste for naturals brought us away from the domination of the washed cup, the classic washed cup syndrome. And in that gap opened by the naturals, which I think is partly driven by consumer taste, we've had a whole, of course, eruption of other possibilities. So I'm going to change my earlier point and say, yeah, I think the consumers have a lot to do with it, and maybe not in a specific stated way, but in their response.
So in the book, there's a timeline that runs in the beginning throughout several pages at the bottom, like a ticker through, coffee in the beginning of, when it was discovered to today. And it highlights certain pivotal moments in the industry, which I love that aspect of the book. I think that's really cool. What to you, now we're talking about these pivotal moments and evolutions in the industry, what to you has been some of the most exciting moments that have really changed the course of specialty coffee that you've gotten to see and be a part of?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there are a lot of moments, I think. If we're talking about pivotal moments, like you can really nail it in terms of time, I think actually, I'll get in trouble for this, but I think that going back to the naturals idea, the release and the success of Starbucks sun-dried Sidamo, and now I'd have to research. It's a good thing writing a book because you can check your own research and you can trust it. But I can't remember the year that was released. But I remember thinking, this has changed the game, because other people were experimenting with natural Ethiopias, and Starbucks was never able to follow through because they're not nimble enough and they buy too much coffee. But the fact that they brought that coffee out and it was so good and so successful, I think really opened up the industry, helped open up the industry and connect the consumer to the idea of processing variations. That's just one small thing. I think the whole change from dark roasting everything to medium roasting, and focusing on the character of the bean, of course, is the most important thing in interior, aside from the environmental and social issues. That's the most important thing that's happened in coffee in the last 20 years. And I can't point any pivotal moment. In the book, I bring out George Howell's founding of terroir coffee in 2004 as a good date, because he was the first one to offer only no blends and all medium roasted coffees. But it wasn't as though it wasn't that singular moment.
Yeah, and George is a peer of yours. He wrote the foreword in the book, and he started around the same year as you, I believe.
Yeah. We came up together, right? George is an enormous contributor, I think, to specialty coffee. I think probably the first cup of excellence in Brazil was important too. I mean, along the cup of excellences have been very influential in terms of the kinds of things we're talking about, taking the industry out of hype and BS and turning it towards, something actual in the cup. I think the focus on the cup of excellence, and even though the consumers don't taste the coffees, I think in the industry as a whole, it's had a profound influence on kind of a more honest and honorable way of assessing excellence.
I think that's a great segue here to a question about the definition of specialty coffee itself. That has evolved over time as we have become more successful with, identifying distinctive characteristics in the cup. Today, so much of what we mean when we say specialty has to do with sustainability, the social and ecological, especially sustainability, and economical, of course, of coffee, beyond the quality of the cup. And I'm curious about when you started to see those two things become somewhat synonymous.
It certainly wasn't there when I started, and it's certainly here now, thank God. There's two aspects to this. There's the certification, fair trade, and so on, which was very important and is less important now. Not organic, but fair trade. The focus is more on a kind of a comprehensive sustainability that includes both social and economic and environmental. But when that really, I'd say maybe, I can't point to a specific event.
Sure. It just kind of evolved into be a fabric of what specialty coffee is about.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there was always the concern, I think, with, not always, but not in 1997, but certainly in this century, a kind of a concern for the producer, both a practical concern, because without the producer making decent money, we can't have decent coffees, and as a kind of a fellow worker, sort of colleague kind of thing, because what we haven't talked about is the rise of communications and people flying to, unfortunately not as much lately, but flying to visit farms, and the producers coming to SCA shows, and all of that sort of direct person-to-person communication has become very important. And so I think that's driven the sustainability issues too, right? Because these are they're our buddies. We're making this together. And so there has to be a kind of a reality to the concern that might have been kind of hypothetical in 2000 or something.
That's a great point, that these tools have allowed us to humanize the supply chain a lot more So the necessary expansion of specialty coffee to these sustainability issues makes it even more special, rather than saying, that these issues confuse the issue. I think maybe just enhances the idea of what specialty is.
Right. It goes very well with the concept of differentiation at origin. Something special done at origin fits in perfectly, really, and that's why I'm very patient with reading the descriptions online about the farmers. I want to go farther than those descriptions, but I value them.
I have just a final question for you here, and this has really been fantastic to get to chat a little bit. And there's so much more we could talk about in your storied career, but I wanted to kind of ask about the future a little bit and talk about how we've discussed advancing. We've advanced in our ability to taste coffee, to brew coffee, to source and roast it, in all of these areas we've advanced. I'm curious where you would like to see the industry continue on to, and what things might we have lost along the way that you would like to see reestablished?
Well, I don't think we've lost too much, to tell you the truth, that we haven't recovered. Pour over, to me, is a great thing that we went back to, for example. So I think there's a kind of a vigilance in the industry for frankly commercial opportunities in past practices. People have been trying to get the mocha pot established again, and I'm happy to say they failed. I mean, I'm not a fan of the mocha pot. It's very difficult to use really well, and so in terms of what I think we need to focus on, well, we need to survive as a planet and as an industry, of course. I mean, that's number one. But so I think we have to be open and supportive of high-tech efforts to improve the viability of coffee seed and not be snobs about it. And we can't wait to do our coffee review tasting. We haven't been able to get enough samples yet to do it of the new varieties that are based on hybrids between Ethiopias and rust-resistant varieties. But at any rate, I think we have to be open to any opportunity we have to strengthen our environment and social matrix around coffee. Specifically, how to do that, I'm not sure. I mean, I think communication is good. Obviously, honest communication, and we've talked a lot about that. And I think there's a lot more honest communication given commercial constraints now than there used to be.
It's interesting, and I completely agree. This is the era where those social bonds need to be fortified, and I take solace in the fact that coffee seems to attract a lot of passionate and creative people.
Yes,
and that's what you need to solve problems.
Yeah, the coffee. That's one of the appeals of the industry. Why I've stayed with it, I think, is I like the people generally.
Generally, yes.
Well, I've seldom run into someone that I don't feel sympathetic to. There's a kind of a commitment to a sensory process, which is a certain kind, brings a certain kind of honesty to it, and there's a kind of interest in bringing hemispheres of experience and economic growth together and growing together that I think attracts good people.
Well, speaking of creative people, solving problems and doing a lot for the industry, this is an amazing time to talk to you about all of your years in coffee. And this book, again, 21st Century Coffee, is fantastic. And you've done such a world of good for the world of coffee. So thank you for all you've done and for being a guest on this show. Definitely an honor to have you. And so I want everyone to read this book. So tell us where people can go to buy this book and just fall in love with coffee all over again.
Well, right now it's available online through a Shopify-driven website that I've started called KennethDavidsCoffee.com. If you type that in, go past Kenneth Davids to coffee, because otherwise you could get some people have been riffing off my name to get on the internet. You can buy it there, and that'd be great. And I'm getting it into other places as well. And I hope I've been a little snobby about Amazon so far, but that may change.
Well, thank you, Kenneth. Again, everyone should check this book out, purchase this, and you've just delivered so much great value in this and in this conversation. So again, thank you for being on Keys to the Shop.
And thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for your thoughtful questions.
Okay, everyone. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation, as it just ranged very widely across different aspects of the industry. And one of the things that is so evident is that, so much of the progress that we've been making is based on the fact that we are closer together through technology and our social structures than ever before. So we can make change in positive directions a lot easier than previously. And so, like we talked about towards the end here, strengthening social bonds and continuing to evolve the quality of coffee, but also how we care for the quality of life for those who work in coffee, and connecting people with resources to enjoy coffee more is exactly what drives Kenneth in all of his businesses and writing, and in this new book, 21st Century Coffee, which you can pick up for yourself over at KennethDavidsCoffee.com. So I want to say a huge thank you to Kenneth Davids for having this conversation and being on the show today. We appreciate your work so much, and truly, I don't think many of us would even really be where we are in the industry today were it not for you serving the coffee community so well all these years. So thank you. And again, don't forget to pick up that book over at KennethDavidsCoffee.com. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback for me about this episode or any other episode of Keys to the Shop, feel free to reach out to me. My email is chris@keystotheshop.com. If you're interested in working with Keys to the Shop Consulting, that's also where you can reach out, chris@keystotheshop.com. Now, I have to let you know that, since we're talking about making sure that we present great information about coffee to our consumers, resourcing yourself with great information about how to run a good coffee bar, how to lead people, and just create a great business, a great coffee business. That's the kind of thing that you get at a place like Coffee Fest. Coffee Fest trade shows have been going for 30 years. This is actually 2022, the 30th year anniversary for Coffee Fest. I've been involved for a small portion of this since 2004 as a presenter and a judge and competitor. But it is unlike any other experience you will have in terms of trade shows and events, because there's a ton of free and accessibly priced workshops, trainings, and seminars that cover a wide variety of topics to help you build an awesome coffee shop. And there's also the trade show floor, of course, where you can interact with vendors one-on-one. There's the coffee community, competitions like latte art and cold brew, and much more. So go to coffeefest.com and see where it's coming up next. We have Chicago toward the end of June. Then there's Los Angeles and Seattle remaining. You can get 50% off your registration, by the way, by using the code KEYS, KEYS. You get 50% off your registration when you go to sign yourself and your team up over at coffeefest.com. And so I hope to see you at these shows. I'll be at all of them. Do introduce yourself. I always love meeting listeners to Keys to the Shop. So again, check them out over at coffeefest.com. And with that, that is the end of our show today. Thanks everyone for joining me. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Kenneth Davids. Don't forget to go to KennethDavidsCoffee.com and pick up your book, 21st Century Coffee. And don't forget to have an amazing day. Thanks again, and as always, I hope this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.